Hi everyone, it's Drake again, and today will be my second video of my Scholar Spotlight series. I think it'll have to be a series because I have at least a handful more, including what I have today, of videos I want to make on specific scholars that fascinate me. My first one was on Stephen Owen, the sinologist. And today is another scholar who made a world-changing contribution to the study of China and its relation to the rest of the world, and that is Joseph Needham. So I'm going to follow the same pattern as I did in my previous Scholar Spotlight. I'm just going to give a brief run-through of the education and formation of Joseph Needham as an intellectual figure, and then because I've read a biography of him, I will talk maybe a little bit more about his life in this one than I did with Stephen Owen, but I will focus on his masterwork, one of the great intellectual feats of the 20th century, which is still in progress. Science and Civilization in China. So that will be the bulk of the video, I would guess. So let's dive right in. Joseph Needham was born in 1900, in December of 1900. And his father was a doctor, so he got a solid education in the sciences from an early age. But his father was also deeply religious, and Joseph Needham continued that throughout the rest of his life. He was a Christian through the rest of his life. He got an amazing education, and Joseph Needham attended Cambridge, Gonville and Caius College at Cambridge. He ended up eventually studying biochemistry under Frederick Hopkins, who, along with a Dutch scientist, discovered vitamins and won the Nobel Prize for that. And then this Hopkins figure, he was president of the Royal Society and all sorts of things. So he allowed Joseph Needham to almost instantly be plugged into the highest levels of British science, the highest levels of Cambridge. I believe at the age of 24, Joseph Needham became a fellow of Gonville and Caius College at Cambridge, which is very, very prestigious, lucky, and also basically rolled out the red carpet for Joseph Needham to have a significant amount of security in his life so that he could pursue his intellectual interests. Joseph Needham was a top-of-the-line biochemist, but after doing research, he wrote a book on the history of embryology, which, was both a mixture of up-to-date research in the field, but also a work in the history of science, where he had to research from the earliest times what were people doing with the study of embryos and embryology, and then all the way up to the current scientific developments of the early 20th century. And it was considered a masterwork. People wrote about it like, oh, this will be Needham's masterwork. This is so impressive that a scholar so young was able to master this field and write this, masterwork on it. And then we get to the late 1930s. Just the historical context: Japan has already invaded China, Manchuria specifically, and is moving south in their invasion. Several Chinese scholars, students, were admitted to Cambridge as PhD students to study chemistry. And Joseph Needham and his wife Dorothy were some of the most important chemists at Cambridge at the time. And Lu Guijun was one of these Chinese students who came to study with Dorothy Needham, actually, Joseph's wife. And both literally, Joseph Needham fell in love with Lu Guijun, but then metaphorically, Joseph Needham fell in love with the Chinese language, Chinese culture, and China in general. And where I'm getting some of my information is Simon Winchester's biography titled The Man Who Loved China. And so at this point, Joseph Needham is 37, and he completely dives in to learning Chinese, understanding the culture, and Lu Guijun helps him, but then he also has other people helping him. And as World War II breaks out in Europe, through a variety of circumstances, Joseph Needham is made a diplomat and is then sent over through the British Foreign Service to China to help out Chinese scientists. While he is there, he's able to establish many connections with some of the most important Chinese scientists of the time in the early 1940s. I believe he went there in 1941 the first time, and then went around the country. He was there to provide scientific materials and support to Chinese scientists, but he was also there because he wanted to learn exactly what was going on in China, what scientific work was being done at the current universities, many of which were kind of ramshackle affairs. All the instruments were in caves so that if the Japanese came in to bomb, they wouldn't lose all their microscopes and things. And indeed, some Chinese scientists were making their own microscopes, grinding the glass themselves, welding pipes out of extra, airplane materials that were, from airplanes, Japanese airplanes shot out of the sky. They take the metal and whip up a machine out of it. So Joseph Needham was just blown away. But along with that, Joseph Needham, as he was walking around Xi'an or other places, Chongqing, he would see a gardener grafting a plum tree. And the technique was totally different than what he was used to seeing in England. But he saw with the care and the specificity with which the gardener was operating that he knew this was a deep, deep tradition of Chinese gardening and botany. And then he had a special robe made for him so that he could wear the traditional clothing. And he saw just the way the tailor operated and the measuring units that the tailor used. That was, again, a deep, deep tradition that didn't look anything like what was being done in Europe at the time. And he started to collect these. From his discussions with Lu Guijun, whose father was an apothecary, a pharmacist in China, she was also able to convey to him a variety of inventions or discoveries that the origin was maybe unknown, or Europeans thought that Europeans developed it first, that actually China had come up with these inventions or discoveries earlier than Europe. Now, who developed them first, at that point, maybe nobody knew, but people in China knew that if they knew anything about Europe, that many of these certain discoveries were definitely predated Europe. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the discussion on science and civilization in China. So we'll scoot forward a little bit. World War II ends. Joseph Needham returns to Cambridge. He's a fellow, so he has his own office. And in 1948, Joseph Needham submits a proposal to Cambridge University Press to write a single volume, a long volume, but a single volume on a comparative study of science and civilization in China in relation to the rest of the world's development of science. And he thought this book would have 7 parts: general introduction, mathematics, physics, chemistry, botany, I think that's basically it, or biology. And then you would have kind of conclusions at the end. And maybe he was imagining this would be a 1,000-page book, but still manageable. Cambridge almost immediately accepts this. Oh, this sounds fascinating, perfect. Needham's an excellent scientist. I'm sure he'll do something good with this. And then I believe within months, maybe within weeks, he realized, okay, this will need to be 7 separate volumes, not just one volume with 7 sections. And he began writing, and it actually ended up being currently there are 25 volumes in print with 2 still in process. So this whole set, when it's all said and done, at least as far as I know, will be 27 volumes, and 25 of which currently are in print. The way the breakdown ended up being done was volume 1 is introductory orientations, mild pun there. Volume 2 was a history of scientific thought, or is a history of scientific thought in China. Volume 3 is mathematics and astronomy, in general, like, the things that are closest to mathematical thinking. Volume 4, which actually ended up being, is it 3 books? 3 books, yes, was physics, is physics. Volume 5 ended up being 13 books, and that is chemistry. Volume 6 is biology, and there are 6 books in the section on biology. And then volume 7 is 2 books, and those are kind of final reflections, overall considerations, maybe further research. And so there ended up being 7 volumes, but like I said, 25 books in print and 27 are in total are predicted. And the first book came out in 1954, so he worked on it for 6 years, from 1948. That's the introductory orientations. And then the next volume, I think, came out in 56 or 58. And that was also kind of that, history of scientific thought in China. So it was also kind of like a preliminary work. But then by the volume on mathematics, people knew, like, oh, this is the real deal. This is changing everything about the history of science, our philosophical understanding of what science is. This is changing also the history of the modern world, in the sense that there's this famous quote by Sir Francis Bacon, this major figure in the history of European scientific thought, where he wrote that the 3 great discoveries and inventions that were needed to create civilization were the compass, printing, and gunpowder. But at his time, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, European scholars didn't know where they came from or when they were invented. They just knew that without those 3 things, modern civilization or society wouldn't exist at all. And Joseph Needham discovered that all 3 of those discoveries and inventions came from China, way, way before Europe ever knew they existed. And so in my discussion on science and civilization in China, I'm going to focus on those books that talk about those 3 discoveries specifically. So we'll begin with the book on the volume on physics, and this is volume 4, book 1, which this is what the covers look like. They're a pretty large. I think this is, yeah, this would still be a quarto size. This is a large quarto. It's extended on this end. And notably on the back, Arnold Toynbee wrote just a glowing review. K.P. Pillai out of Calcutta wrote just another glowing review. Lawrence Picken, this is the famous one you'll see quoted. Perhaps the greatest single act of historical synthesis and intercultural communication ever attempted by one man. And like I was saying, this volume came out in 1962. And this is the first book in the section on physics. But this book talks about, among other things, the development, the understanding of magnetism, but then the development of compasses. Development of the magnetic compass in China on page 249. And he also, the thing that I think is really amazing about this series is that it's not just saying, oh, China did this, then China did this, then China did this. He connects it also to the development in Europe, Islam, India to the degree that he could. But I think even till this day, for some reason, our understanding of science and scientific developments in India isn't as cohesively presented as it is. Obviously, like development of science in Europe is almost too excessively well trodden. And then because of Joseph Needham, basically, Chinese developments in science are very well known now. And then I'll get to some information on Islamic society. But yeah, this volume talks about Sung compasses, wet and dry, references in Tong and earlier, the Han diviners and the lodestone spoon, use of compass in navigation, mariner's compass, magnetic declination. And basically what Joseph Needham found is that, the compass was used obviously by Europeans to, get to, the New World, Turtle Island, and so on and so on. And Europeans maybe thought, oh, well, maybe we discovered it at some point. It just goes back. We talk, there are references in the Middle Ages, like Roger Bacon, so on and so on. But Joseph Needham basically found that, yeah, the compass basically goes back to the Han Dynasty period, at least as far as like use of, magnetism to tell the north and south and so on. And so already by this volume, Joseph Needham has proven that major world-changing developments took place in China, 1,000 years before Europe ever got the slightest idea. Then we're going to move forward to one of my favorite volumes, which is the volume on paper and printing, which is the first book in volume 5, which is on chemistry. Now, volumes 2, 3, and 4 were printed first in the series on chemistry, and then this volume came out in 1985, and it was the first book not actually either in full or chiefly written by Joseph Needham. Qian Xuan Hsiun wrote this volume totally in full, and he is the librarian, professor emeritus of Chinese literature and library science, and curator emeritus of the Far Eastern Library at the University of Chicago. And so he wrote this volume in full, and he did an amazing job. He uses the same organizational principles as Joseph Needham. It's comparative. It's a deep study of primary texts, but it's also totally cohesive and talks about the origin, development, migration of paper and printmaking. And paper was developed in China during the Han Dynasty as well. The Han Dynasty is arguably the most important scientific industrial revolution in human history. The European scientific and industrial revolution that comes in the, let's say, the 15th century through the 18th century was less world-changing than what was going on in China during the Han Dynasty. And that's one of the research projects I have through reading this series, is what was really going on in the Han Dynasty, and what historical processes brought about such an amazing, like, world-changing development. So we already have the compass that comes from the Han Dynasty. Then we have paper, which comes from the Han Dynasty. Printmaking came a little bit later, but printmaking in China precedes it in Europe by 1,000 years. So this Gutenberg, amazing printer, he just pulled a printer out of his ass, he's a jewel maker, and he just somehow whipped it up. Obviously he got everything he knew from the East. Sure, it's of course impressive what he did, and it, changed the world and so on and so on, but definitely he would have done nothing if printmaking hadn't have already been, perfected basically in China, and then spread through India, the Islamic world, and then came up to Europe in the, 1400s. So that's just been amazing. Also, the author of this volume talks about the Dunhuang manuscripts, which were, it was a Buddhist monastery on a major node in the Silk Road, but Dunhuang was basically ransacked in the early 20th century by several Western scholars. It's really a travesty. It's an ethical travesty that, still has not been atoned for. All the manuscripts that were stolen from that monastery should be returned, at the very least to China, but if not, directly to a museum affiliated with, Buddhist history and so on and so on. But one of the most amazing discoveries there, though, was a Tang Dynasty edition of the Lotus Sutra. I believe it's the Lotus Sutra. Yeah, I think it has to be, yeah. But what that did is it proved that both paper was traceable back to the Tang Dynasty, but printing was traceable back to the Tang Dynasty. And that extended our range by hundreds of years, our meaning like European society's understanding of paper and printmaking and printing. And then subsequent research pushed it back even further to the Han Dynasty. So that is the volume on paper and printmaking. And then we still have one development that Francis Bacon said changed the world and is what allowed civilization to come about. And that is gunpowder, which is written about in Volume 5, Book 7, which came out in 1986, 1 year after the one I just previously mentioned. And Joseph Needham wrote this one with collaboration of Ho Ping-yok, Lu Guijun, and Wang Ling. Wang Ling is another figure that needs to be mentioned because he was Joseph Needham's main research assistant for the early years, for the first 10 to 15 years of this project. And absolutely, without Wang Ling, Joseph Needham would not have been able to do this. There are several other figures that, without their help, Chinese scholars, that without their help, Joseph Needham would not have been able to write this series. several Chinese scholars were sending major collections of original Chinese texts to Joseph Needham in Cambridge. And because of that, because of this amazing collection of manuscripts and research that that was compiled in Cambridge, there's a Needham Research Institute that still to this day houses all these materials related to science and civilization in China and Needham's life. And yeah, it's still the main research hub for the production of at least the next 2 volumes, or the last 2 volumes in this series. They have their own website. Another thing I'm going to post in this video in the description is there is a documentary series covering Joseph Needham's life. It's not the best documentary series you have ever seen in your life, but it covers the most important information. It is a bit too repetitive, but yeah, if you watch through that whole series, you'll pretty much get what Simon Winchester talks about in his biography. I don't like Simon Winchester's biography. It's too gossip-filled. If you compare like the actual substantial information on the Science and Civilization in China series or his other intellectual efforts with gossip, it's like 30% intellectual history with 70% gossip and like travels and stuff. So there needs to be, you know, maybe when this series is finished, maybe someone will be able to put out just a truly magnificent academic intellectual study of Joseph Needham, you know, 800-page academic biography. That's what we need. He's a vital figure for the intellectual history of the 20th century. Joseph Needham is. So maybe, here's to hoping, maybe in the next 10 to 20 years or so, we'll get something like that. But the Simon Winchester, it's not terrible. And I would say, if anything in this video fascinates you, you can get the Simon Winchester biography for very cheap, and it's a quick read too. I just finished it a little over a week ago, which is why I'm able to make this video now, because I was able to fill in some gaps. Let's see, what are the other volumes I really was interested in? Well, the one on gunpowder, I kind of gave the short shrift to it. So gunpowder was developed in China by the Tang Dynasty, but interestingly enough, it was originally used for, there's a tradition in China actually of using smoke to, as an insecticide and insect repellent in homes. Yearly Chinese, in Chinese culture, it was a ritual to perform a smoke ritual in your house, and that would help prevent pests, especially in libraries. That was done. A particular plant was burned, and then the smoke that created prevented pests. Also, when people got sick, it was known that their clothing could harbor the disease. And so they would steam and smoke out the clothing of the sick person so that other people didn't get sick, which is just remarkable. And gunpowder, though, was used not originally for warfare, but was used for fireworks and alchemical purposes to make smoke and heat. And then eventually, over hundreds of years, it was found out that it could be used to make, you know, like grenades and bombs. And then eventually it was found out that, oh yeah, if you confine the smoke and the expansion of these gases, it can propel something like a cannon. And then obviously a small cannon turns into a gun. And then, yeah, it took 600 years for that to get to Europe, through the Middle East to Byzantium to Western Europe. And yeah, I mean, arguably that might be the invention that changed life the most, because then you get the horrifying effects of machine guns and massive bombs that were developed in the 20th century, and then where this history ends, at least in our day, is with nuclear technology. Because without the discoveries that were done with bombs and cannons and so on, we wouldn't have nuclear bombs. And actually, Joseph Needham says something remarkable in the introduction to this volume, so I'll read that out. That might be a good place to end. So, Joseph Needham, get to the author's note here. Actually, I'll add in one other thing while I get to this author's note. I've been building up my own personal collection of these volumes. I do plan to get all of them. And I was actually able to pick up volumes from Tom Ayling. Well, I'll link his channel in the description of this video. Let's see, where does he talk about it? Yeah, Tom Ayling, though, was nice enough to send me these volumes from the UK. So very grateful for that. I thought it was in this volume, but Joseph Needham also talks about here, the author's note, that and in turn, one developed most of the fire lance, while the other was the rocket on which all space travel depends. And so, but he does also talk about, I thought it was this volume, but maybe it wasn't, maybe it was a different introduction, but yeah, he basically says that we now have the ability as humans to end this just breathtakingly beautiful collection of knowledge and technique and ritual practice that has given us science. And I would love to hear an argument against the idea that science, as a body of practice and theory, it's one of the greatest developments of human culture in its entire span. And I'm using a broad understanding of what science is. The science that we can see in Chinese culture, the science that we can see, of course, as well in Islam. And here's a partner volume to this series, Science and Civilization in Islam by Syed Hossein Nasr, who is just a fascinating scholar. You'll be hearing more about him in coming months from me. Yeah, this was clearly paired with Joseph Needham's set. There are a couple volumes called, Science and Society in Ancient India, but those are harder to come by. I'm still working on getting a hold of those, but they were also in this Needham trajectory. And then Joseph Needham, through his research, totally changed our understanding of Western science. And I think there's really not a cohesive study of global science at this point. And also, there is a big gap, lacunae, in our understanding of science in the Americas, especially preceding the arrival of Europeans. And that's going to be one of my research interests as I work my way through this Joseph Needham set. My goal, I've set myself kind of a decades-long reading project where I want to read about 1,000 pages of this Joseph Needham a year. So that'll either mean 1 or 2 volumes generally a year. And so that'll mean that if the next 2 volumes get put out, that'll mean that in the next 10 to 15 years, I'll have read the entire set. And of course, I'll be reading other stuff in the meantime. That'll probably take about a month a year, maybe each summer or each winter. I can set up a reading plan for that. But yeah, I mean, in addition to a figure like Stephen Owen, Joseph Needham didn't need to do any of this. If he hadn't have worked on this set, he could have continued in biochemistry, and he could have won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry. He could have been one of the top biochemists on Earth. And there were times in his life when people questioned why he was working on this. Oh, what are you doing, Needham? He's lost it. He could have made some world-changing discovery in biochemistry and won a Nobel and, you know, rested on his laurels, as they say. But I just find it so inspiring that Joseph Needham followed his curiosity, fell in love with another culture, not used his love, but through his love was able to share the beauty of Chinese society and culture and history with the rest of the world. And it's world-changing. It's world-changing, truly. And I think that's a way forward from the small-mindedness that plagues the United States today. I am surrounded by brain-dead behavior every day. Small-mindedness, just, you know, you don't have a word for it, but it's so disgusting, the kind of small-mindedness you see in America today, the United States. And other countries. I'm American. I'm a United States citizen, so I have to look at this most closely, unfortunately. But in that same way, we also get a pattern, we get inspiration and a pattern on the way out. If we all do our own part, like Joseph Needham did his, you know, just, you know, gargantuan task of intercultural communication, if we all do our own part, I think the world, at least our own worlds, will be much enriched and fulfilled. At least I can say that's been the case for my life. So that'll be the end of this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Yeah, there are shortened versions of Science and Civilization in China that you can find, abridgments. I think there's a 6-volume abridgment, and then I think there's maybe a 2-volume abridgment. But check those out. And then, yeah, the biography I mentioned, Simon Winchester, The Man Who Loved China, is also fascinating, quick read. And then I will link the documentary series. So thank you for watching. Death is a Gang Boss. And more scholar spotlights on the way. If you liked this video and you have a scholar you want to share, please make your own video and let me know that you did. Thanks for watching.